Hello, welcome to Edupedia World Video. In this video, we will talk about ancient civilization of India. First of all, we will say a few words about the origin of Indian people and the origin of their name. In order to find out the origin of Indian people, we have to disclose the origin of all other nations as well, the origin of all people, the humankind in general. Namely, as we have said in previous lectures, all nations and all people living today, including Indian people, descended from the early prehistoric people, that is, from the very first created people. Scientists still debate how those first people appeared, so we will not talk about that topic. Genetic researchers tell us that all nations actually descended from three groups of early people. In other words, all nations can be categorized into some of those three groups. Linguists also sometimes divide languages of all people in three main groups, or language families. And lastly, there are ancient primary written historical sources about the origin of all nations from the original three groups of early people. These three groups of people descended from their respective ancestors, who in return were descended from the first people. Different nations belonging to one group are very similar and related to each other, while nations belonging to separate groups are slightly less related among each other, though again they are all descendants of the same early people, which practically makes them all related. European, Asian, American, African, and Australian nations and tribes, we all have the same parents. The first group is usually called Indo-European group or family. It refers to all nations living from India to Europe, that is, all European and some of the Asian nations. Another name for this group is Japhetic group of people. The second group is usually called Semitic, comprising of Semitic nations, mostly living in Middle East today. And the third group is called Hamitic, comprising mostly of African and many Asian and American nations. Modern scientists sometimes blend these two groups together, calling them Afro-Asiatic group of people. There are also other different names for each of these groups, and there are many other classifications of modern nations, but we will stick to this three-group classification, which is the oldest. Indian people belong to Indo-European or Japhetic group because they speak an Indo-European language. It means it is very similar and related to all other Indo-European languages, such as languages of all European nations. We could now place all other ancient people we mentioned in our last lecture to each of these three groups. For example, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and all other ancient and modern-day European nations belong to the same group as Indian people does, Indo-European group of people. Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, Syrians, Arabs, and Hebrews belong to Semitic group of people, while ancient Egyptians, Canaanites, Hittites, Ethiopians, and many other nations belong to Hamitic group of people. Ancient Hittites are mainly considered to have been an Indo-European people by modern historians, but the ancient writings about their origin tells us that they were Hamitic nation. It is important to note that there are no genetically pure nations, that is, nations that belong exclusively to one of these three original groups of nations. The modern-day nations are classified that way mostly depending on language they speak. The truth is, however, that all nations possess genes of all three groups of people's ancestors. For instance, although Indian people belong to Indo-European group because they speak an Indo-European language, a great part of them descended from their Hamitic ancestors. Or many South Slavic people living today in Balkan area also partially descended from ancient Hamitic people, though they speak Slavic, and Indo-European language. We are all descendants of numerous different ancient tribes who have been mixing among each other for thousands of years. This again proves we are all brothers and sisters, that all the nations in the world descended from the same early people. Concerning the origin of Indian people's name, again we have to see the origin of names of all other nations as well. Indeed, why are Indians called Indians? And why is any other nation called the way it is? How were they named and who named them? All nations in the world have many different names used at the same time, but usually only a few or only one is the original domestic name. And while other names could have been given by other foreign nations, the real question is, how did they receive their original name and from whom? We will refer to a historical source written by ancient Roman historian Josephus Flavius. He said, "Some of the nations still retain the denominations which were given them by their first founders, but some have lost them, and some have only admitted certain changes in them, that they might be the more intelligible to the inhabitants." So all ancient nations were named after their founders, that is, after the name of their ancestors and progenitors. The same way today, families of many different nations are named after their founder and ancestor. For instance, ancient Greeks' original name was Yavanes, which was later corrupted into Ionians. This name originates from the name of the founder of their nation, who was called Javan. Some of the modern-day nations still call them that way. Or take Hebrews for another example. Their modern name comes from their ancestor Heber, who lived in very distant past. The same goes for Indian people. Their original domestic name is Bharat, which comes from the name of their ancestor, called Bharata. It is quite logical that his descendants, Indian people, would be named after him. Bharata is considered to have been the first king of India, conqueror of the whole world, and the founder and progenitor of all Indians. There is an interesting legend about him. It is said that King Bharata conquered the whole world, and wishing to proclaim his world dominance, he climbed up to the highest mountain peak in order to place his flag upon it. However, when he got there, he saw many flags already standing from many other world conquerors who lived before him. Bharata realized that in spite of conquering the whole world, they were easily forgotten and perished as all other people. So he decided to dedicate to more spiritual life filled with joy and happiness. That is the legend about the Indian king Bharata. The name India itself comes from the name of the river Indus, which is only a western version of the original Indian name of that river, which is Sindhu. They were named that way because their civilization was founded in the Indus River valley. In this video, we will only use this term, Indian people, and not the original name Bharat or the term Hindu people, used by majority of modern historians, despite the fact that the name Indians normally refers to native Indian tribes of North America. Do not get confused. As said previously, the ancient Indian civilization was founded in the Indus River valley by early people coming from the world homeland Mesopotamia, that is, by their Indo-European or Japhetic ancestors, although a part of India was inhabited by their Hamitic ancestors as well. Majority of modern historians refer to this event of early migrations of Indian ancestors and founding of the ancient Indian civilization as Indo-Aryan migration. However, we should emphasize that many would disagree with this theory, considering it to be a Eurocentrist biased view on early history of Indian civilization. Historians today usually call it the Indus Valley Civilization or Harappan Civilization, named after an ancient archaeological site in northern India. Ancient history of India is usually divided into three periods: prehistoric period, Vedic period, and classical period. The prehistoric period refers to the most distant past of India and the very founding of their civilization. The Vedic period refers to time period from around 18th century BC to 6th century BC, while the classical period refers to time period from that time to late Middle Ages. Remember that periodizations of history only serve to help us study events from the past. It is only an artificial pattern created by modern historians. Concerning the so-called Vedic period, in the most remote past, there were many independent tribes and kingdoms in India. Actually, during a great part of Indian history, numerous separated kingdoms existed at the same time, only temporarily unifying and forming a united Indian empire. This unification was usually performed by conquests of individual Indian military leaders. And of course, only when they were united that way, they could resist and defend themselves from other neighboring hostile tribes that were constantly trying to take away their lands. However, as in the case of other ancient civilizations, Indian tribes and kingdoms were fighting even among each other since the most ancient times, thus becoming an easy prey for other conquering nations nearby. Old Indian historical texts tell us about those wars. One of the most known wars during that early period was the so-called Kurukshetra war. It is said that the battle lasted for 18 days, and that all the tribes and kingdoms of India took part in it. Millions of their warriors died during that war, they say. Another great battle from those times was the so-called Battle of the Ten Kings, described in the Indian epic Rig Veda. Some historians believe this was one of the wars waged between Japhetic and Hamitic ancestors of India. The result of this war was the formation of the Kuru kingdom in 12th century BC, as the first recorded Indian state in the real sense of that word. The most famous ruler of that age was King Parikshit. After the Kuru kingdom downfall, many other independent kingdoms formed in various parts of India, fighting among each other through centuries. At certain times, some of them would prevail and achieve dominance over the others, but would eventually be replaced by other new kingdoms and their dynasties. As in the case of other civilizations, because they were quarreling and not united, other adjacent nations attacked their kingdoms and conquered them all. Some of those nations were Persians, Scythians, Huns, Turkic tribes, and finally Greeks. The famous king of Macedonia and Greece, Alexander the Great, defeated Indian king Porus and conquered a part of India, Punjab. However, after the death of Alexander the Macedonian, Indians defeated Greeks, liberated their lands, and formed a united Indian empire called Maurya Empire. Its founder was King Chandragupta Maurya. He defeated the Greeks in several battles, as well as other Indian pretenders to the throne. One of the equally famous rulers from the Maurya dynasty was King Ashoka the Great. He expanded Indian territories even more and was known for wide acceptance of Buddhism as state religion. We will say something more about Indian Buddhism at the end of this lecture. After the fall of Maurya dynasty, a new dynasty arose, called Mahameghavahana dynasty. Its most prominent ruler was King Kharavela, who formed new great Indian empire during the 2nd century conquests. Afterwards, many other Indian kingdoms, dynasties, and rulers were replacing each other. One of the most powerful was the Gupta Empire. The Gupta dynasty ruled over India from 3rd to 6th century of New Era. This period of Indian ancient history is sometimes called the Golden Age of India, since many new inventions and discoveries were made in the field of science, religion, and arts. One of the most famous rulers of those times was Chandragupta I, who should not be confused with the earlier Indian ruler Chandragupta Maurya. In the 6th century, the empire collapsed due to invasion of Huns and wars with other minor Indian self-proclaimed rulers. From the rich and well-documented ancient history of India, we can see the very same pattern existing as in other ancient civilizations' history. And that is, when people were united, they were undefeatable, but when they were quarreling over material possessions and indulged in immorality, other hostile and conquering nations would always defeat them and take away all their possessions and lands. For the end of this lecture, let's say something about ancient Indian culture, religion, and mythology. Ancient Indian civilization was very advanced from its beginnings, as in the case of all other civilizations of that age, such as Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, or Mayan civilization. Many prehistoric and earliest historic sites remains can be seen even today. Ancient Indians were well acquainted with architecture, as well as with medicine, astronomy, historiography, and many other sciences. From the dawn of their history, they used pictographic writing system, now called the Indus Valley script, which is not yet deciphered though. In much later period, Indians started using the syllabic and alphabetic script, originally derived from the oldest phonetic writing system, the so-called Phoenician alphabet. Those Indian scripts are called the Kharoshthi and Brahmi script. The contemporary Indian script, called Devanagari, was derived from the Brahmi-like scripts. Regarding their ancient writing, Indians produced some of the most famous literature works and epics, such as Mahabharata, as the longest epic in the world with its more than 200,000 verses, then Ramayana, Vedas such as Rigveda, Puranas, and others. All of these epics, texts, and hymns concern the most ancient history of India, its mythology and religion, mainly Hinduism and Buddhism. Although ancient Indians perhaps practiced the original monotheistic religion in the most distant past, they are primarily known for their religion of Hinduism, which was one of the oldest polytheistic religion systems. Ancient Indians worshipped many gods, heroes, and other divinities, as all other ancient nations did. Some of those divinities' names are presented here, the most famous being God Indra, Shiva, and Vishnu. We should remind ourselves that many of those divinities and stories about them represent vague and corrupted memories of real historical events and people from the most distant past of both Indian and human history in general. For example, one of the most known Indian mythological figures is Manu. He is considered to be the progenitor of all humankind, having survived the great flood that destroyed the whole world. The Indian legend about Manu is identical to other ancient people's legends about some worldwide flood, which all represent a vague memory of natural disasters before the Ice Age, as we have said in earlier lecture. Beside Hinduism, India is also a cradle of another world-famous ancient religion, Buddhism. The founder of Buddhism was Siddhartha Gautama, a sage, philosopher, and teacher who lived in 6th century BC, known as Buddha. The main concepts of Buddhism are nirvana and reincarnation. The nirvana concept refers to a state of complete spirituality, asceticism, and absence of any earthly desires, so to say, while reincarnation is defined as belief in rebirth after death into some form of life. Buddhism is perhaps closer to some sort of spiritual philosophy, rather than fully developed religion system akin to other ancient religion systems. There are many kinds of Buddhism, as well as other religions in India, such as Jainism, but Buddhism and Hinduism have been the main religion systems of Indian civilization. Thank you for watching Edupedia World video.